So, welcome to this little discussion with Aashia, Emma, and Elodie. Hi guys, you want to say hello?
Hi.
Hey. Hello.
So today we're going to be talking about cultural appropriation. First, I wanted to kind of take a look at kids and Halloween costumes, and there's been a lot of controversy about this in the last few years with the release of films like Moana and Black Panther. It's really just brought up the topic. So first I'll just hit you guys with the question. If your little girl came up to you and said she wanted to dress as Moana for Halloween, how would you react?
Okay. Well, for me, I guess there's I think it's a little bit more complicated for me as I am brown. I can pass in a sense as someone who isn't exactly appropriating the costume, right? And so it's maybe not as problematic as a small blonde girl wearing a Moana's tribal dress. That's maybe not the same thing. But I think it's really important to remember when you're a person of color that just because you are a minority or you're a person of color doesn't excuse you from behavior that would otherwise be oppressive to other minorities and people of color, right? I think if I was to have a daughter who was I want to wear a Moana costume, I think inherently there's a part of me that's well, nobody I think would question me about it, but I think I would personally feel a bit uncomfortable with trying to pass my daughter off as a Polynesian girl and be oh, I'm exempt from this experience, I'm exempt from the problematic parts of this experience, right? But then there's also the added dimension of when you are a person of color, and particularly with things like costumes and Disney and stuff like that, where do you draw the line in terms of representation? So there is one Indian girl in all of Disney, and she's in Mowgli. She's in Jungle Book, right?
Oh, yeah.
And her costume, she's wearing a tiny blue dress and a bindi, and that's it.
Oh my god.
That's her whole costume. And it's okay, I'll just wear Indian clothes for Halloween, I would guess. Same thing. And so it's kind of okay, if there is the representation of people who look like me, am I allowed to pick up on the other sort of minority representation? Am I allowed to dress up as Moana? Am I allowed to dress up as Jasmine? And I think it's not necessarily for me to say whether or not a Polynesian person should feel uncomfortable with a young Indian girl dressing up as a Polynesian character. But I think when there are issues of whether or not people of color are represented and whether or not they have people who look like them, if you're kind of scrambling for the thing that's closest and there's still something that you can go for, I think that's a little bit more understandable than trying to make a caricature out of a outfit as a young white girl, you know?
Okay.
Yeah.
Emma, how do you think you'd react?
I think that all makes sense, but I feel I'm still very much confused on the question itself. And you just sort of said, I could pass as Polynesian, but what about any other person if they weren't Polynesian? Let's say me, who I'm white and blonde, Aryan as they get. And what if my daughter, we're talking about children in this sense, wanted to dress as Moana? Very clearly not going to pass as Polynesian in any shape or form. Is that, I'm interested in your opinion genuinely, is that okay? Or is that cultural appropriation? Where is the line drawn?
So I think if we're looking at I think with cultural appropriation, there's a distinct line between dressing up as a character who is of a certain ethnic background and dressing up as a person from that ethnic background, right? There's a difference between being I am dressing up as Moana and I am dressing up as tribal girl, quote unquote tribal girl outfit. Those two things are very different, expressions of appropriation. The reason I think that's important to acknowledge is that when it comes to people of color, I don't necessarily think that when it comes to Disney and things like that, that dressing up as a character, like a Disney character who has a very distinct costume, is appropriation, because you're not making a costume out of anything. That is a person. That is a person who wears a distinct thing. You're dressing up as that person.
Right.
But I think that when it comes down to like, if you are like a white mom and your white daughter is like, I want to dress up as Moana, the distinct sort of like thing that you have to remember is that like a lot of the times I think when it comes to like characters and representation of young people, it can feel kind of like if you are a young person of color and there's finally a character that represents you, and suddenly there's just like this whole horde of like white people who have all these characters and all of this option,
Yeah.
and just they're like, oh, I want to do this, like I want to do this, like I want to also do this. And it's like these young girls, you know, if they dress up as like white characters, while it's not necessarily problematic, they're not given the same sort of credit as like if you're like a young blonde girl and you dress as Cinderella,
Yeah.
and you're like a young Indian girl and you dress as a Cinderella, it's like those two things look very different, and so people are more likely to question it, right? It's not necessarily people are going to tell you like you cannot dress up as Cinderella, but it's kind of like young girls never feel like they can dress up as a character from Disney when they're a person of color, because a lot of the time there's nothing that actually feels like they look like the character. And the reason why young girls, for example, dress up as Disney princesses is because they want to feel like those princesses, right? And if you can't, like, because there's no one that looks like you, when there are suddenly characters that do look like you, but there are just these like other like white girls and like non-POCs who want to do the same thing. It's kind of like this experience for people of color where it's like, why can't we have this thing, you know? Why can't this be, why can't we finally have a thing that is like devoted to us without it being like, oh, but like my daughter wants to dress up as Moana, that's not wrong. I don't necessarily think any of these things are blatantly like racist or like problematic, right? When it comes to like specifically characters. I don't necessarily think if you're like a young like white girl, if you dress up as Moana, I'm gonna be like, hey, 6-year-old girl, you're racist. Like that's not what I think it is.
Yeah.
But I think what happens is that it encroaches on an experience for young girls who are like minority, and it can make them feel a certain way. It can make them feel kind of like, you know, they don't have anything that's allowed to be just for them, when everything is allowed to be just for white people, you know, even if it's not explicitly stated as such.
So
It is treated as such.
I wanted to introduce this other question because I was reading this article by a woman on a website called Race Conscious Raising Children.
Okay.
And I actually found myself almost a bit frustrated when I was reading the article because her daughter was talking about how she wanted to dress up as Moana, and the mum was trying to, you know, overcome this with different ways they could not appropriate, and that's all fine. But it kind of brought up the question to me of, is this idea of appropriation when it comes to young children, is us telling them about that actually increasing the divide between races? Is this reinforcing the idea of the other in a way? Because children are colourblind, very much so. At a young age, you know, if they're brought up, hopefully in a non-racist household, they would be quite colourblind. And I was just curious as to what you thought, both of you, in terms of, is it somewhat harmful, or is it just the way it's got to be because we do live in an imperfect society?
I think we're trying, which is good, we're trying to raise more awareness, and we're trying to change and shape our previous thoughts and inclinations about race, and we're becoming more open to the idea of stuff like cultural appropriation. But I think there's definitely that area where we take it too far, and when we're trying to help, it does, like you say, hinder. So it's good. I mean, the children should be taught and they should be aware, because it's still going to happen, and they're still inevitably probably going to commit some cultural appropriation themselves, whether they recognise that or not. So it's good for them to be aware, but there is definitely a line where you can cross and go too far and to become overly protective and try to stop them from having any fun. And just taking it a little bit too far. I think that's definitely a possibility.
Aashia, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think when it comes to like raising your children as race conscious, right, particularly with the aspect of like cultural appropriation, there are like several things you kind of need to consider. The first and foremost thing, I think, is people need to understand what cultural appropriation actually is, right? And there are two spheres of this. The very basic one is understanding that different people of color who have different experiences with appropriation, like my experience as an Indian girl of appropriation is much different to like the Black community, right? And how people appropriate their culture. So what I understand of what appropriation means could be completely different to someone else's, right? I think the first and foremost way you must be willing to make your family race conscious is not necessarily being like, oh, this might be offensive. I'm not gonna. Well, that is good to do, right? If you think something might be offensive to a group of people, chances it probably might be. Like, you're not just gonna come up with that from nowhere, right? If there's a chance that that could happen, it is good to avoid doing stuff like that. And that is an aspect of race consciousness. But I think the most important thing when it comes to raising your family as race conscious is being aware of the fact that you will never know the full extent to which something is like derogatory or offensive or discriminatory or stereotypical, but you need to be willing to listen to criticism.
Yes.
So I think when it comes to teaching your kids about like race and particularly cultural appropriation, first I'm gonna like start by slightly disagreeing with the idea that children are colorblind if they grew up in like a quote unquote like unbiased family. I think like kids are naturally put in with biases, even if it's not from their parents, whether it be from like school or like the media and like all of this stuff. You like, even if you are being particularly conscious to teach your kids to be like racially aware, which I don't think is the same thing as being colorblind. I think like
That's
understanding race is different from ignoring it, and I think understanding race is more important. But I think like kids get like influences from literally everywhere, and so I think regardless of what your parenting style is, kids are going to become aware of racial bias one way or another.
That's true.
Right? It's up to the parents to try to negate that as much as possible. So I think when it comes to cultural appropriation, your kid comes up to you being like, I want to dress up as Moana. Your child is not being actively racist in doing so, right? They like this character, they want to dress up as this character, right?
Yeah.
Whether or not you decide to also doesn't determine whether or not you are like being racially insensitive. I think it's totally like acceptable if your kid is like determined to dress up as a character that is a person of color. Like, fine, like your kid wants to do a thing, like it's okay. But I think where you have to draw the line is teaching your kids when other things are like bad, right?
Okay.
And I think the example that I always go to, particularly with the idea of like Halloween and kids' costumes and stuff, is there are a lot of kids' costumes, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, that are like literally just cultural things. Like dressing up as like a tribes person, or dressing up as like Native American, or dressing up as like Mexican wearing a sombrero. Like those are things that are actively culturally appropriation.
Blatantly racist.
Right? Yeah, blatantly this is appropriating culture. And so this kind of comes back into like what is cultural appropriation. For me, cultural appropriation isn't like dressing up as a character who's from a specific background.
Okay.
Like that's not that big of a deal, right? Whether or not people of color judge you if you're, like, your kid is like white and dresses up as Moana because she's like clearly not Polynesian, like that doesn't necessarily make it like insensitive to do something like that. But I think when it comes to what cultural appropriation actually is, it's when aspects of a culture are used by people who are not from that culture, right? For whatever they want it, like for whatever gain they want to get from that, like whether it's they want to look better, whether they want to like experience a certain like culture, but like not fully grasp the like experience that like especially the negative experience that culture may have. Like there are aspects of cultural appropriation that are basically just people wanting to take parts of cultures and use them and like adopt them wherever they want to
And exploit them.
without exploit them. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. People want to take like aspects of a culture, exploit them without understanding the full experience, especially negative ones that people of those cultures may have associated with that thing. B, like not fully respecting the background of that cultural experience. You see that a lot when people are appropriating stuff like Dia de los Muertos for like Mexican people, where like people want to paint like candy skulls on their face but don't want to acknowledge like the huge like historical and like vaguely oppressive like background of the experience of this event, and how like people have faced oppression for wanting to pursue their belief, right? Like Mexican people have. And C, I think the big part that falls into why appropriation comes into play when it comes to like costumes and outfits and stuff is that a lot of the times people are appropriating, exploiting parts of cultures that the people who actually do those things aren't allowed to do without getting like
Backlash.
negative feedback or like being made fun of.
Okay, so actually I saw this one example. I think it was in possibly a Vogue video. I was explaining how Hawaiian costumes were quite offensive. Because it was her own grandmother was never allowed to learn the hula and take part in this like tradition during this time when she was growing up, and it was like banned for her. And then now that like it's finally free for her to do that, she's able to take the time and do this, like create this beautiful costume. And people are just parading around in it in some stereotypical plastic one from like the party shop or whatever. And
Absolutely.
it's quite interesting.
I really like how they brought around this new word as a result of cultural appropriation. We now have a cultural appreciation, and I think people often get those lines blurred. And I don't know. I feel like I should clear it up. Not me personally, but just
you could possibly read.
We found this quote earlier, saying race and power takes an element of another race's culture. So it's when we talk about like what culture they're stealing, because obviously there's elements of everyone's culture that is shouldn't be taken for granted. But it's when it's not always racial, is it? Actually,
no.
You've got down there. It's
I
race
don't
and
think
power.
So.
It's when someone who I don't know how to phrase this. Someone who stereotypically, historically, has been not higher, but who has power over another race.
So in terms of you're right that like a lot of these experience aren't inherently about race, in the sense where it's not inherently about like I am a white person, this person is a black person, right? I am appropriating something from their culture. What it is a dynamic of power. That's exactly what you're completely right about that. It's about the fact that I am a white person, that person is a black person, right? I have historically and even currently have a position of power over them in terms of the racial structures present in society. And so when I appropriate something from their culture, there is a huge dynamic of like, you are not allowed to enjoy this without people in other positions of power like trying to oppress you, but I am, because I think it's cool.
Yeah.
So that's exactly how like things of power come into play. And the example of like the Hawaiian experience is such a good example as well. Another really like clear example of something like this is like when it comes to like Native American outfits and the whole thing of like wearing like war headdresses and things like that, and it just being like a costume, even if it's for kids, right? Historically, Native Americans had their entire culture like ripped away from them, right? I currently live in Canada, right? Where like the indigenous relationships are so similar to that of like the United States, but as opposed to like Native American people and like indigenous people being put in reservations, they were taken into these schools where they basically had like they weren't allowed to like speak in their native languages. They weren't allowed to wear like the clothing they were already wearing. Like they had to wear new clothes and stuff. It was it was massively oppressive, right? And so these things that are now like part of like quote unquote like Indian costumes or Native American costumes or whatever, are things that were taken away from Native American people, right? And so when this comes into play with like the whole kids costumes things and like Moana and stuff, dressing up specifically as Moana isn't necessarily playing into the background of like Polynesian oppression. You're dressing up as a character. That's a very specific thing.
Right.
But on the flip side, if you're dressing up, even if you want to kind of look like Moana, but you're dressing up as like a Polynesian person, so you're dressing up as, let's say, like a Hawaiian girl, right? You are stereotyping what Hawaiian people wear, right? On a very basic level. But beyond that, you're taking these things that are so so they're not necessarily like super incremental in the culture itself, but they were things that represented the culture that ultimately were taken away from them. Ultimately were used to like create really like damaging stereotypes of what these people look like and what these people act like. You know,
Yeah.
like the characterization of like Hawaiian people as just like these hula girls and surf boys is like hugely damaging and like stops Hawaiian people from being able to integrate into like greater American society without having these stereotypes enforced on them. And so you have to be able to acknowledge in the greater sphere of like understanding cultural appropriation whether your experience of like your kid going for a costume that's like a distinct character that they just like, and the difference between them being like, oh, I like this costume, but it's like a caricature of a culture, right? That's where you have to be like, this is not acceptable. You're not supposed to wear things like that because it's damaging to the people who actually wear those outfits like in their lives or like historically their ancestors have worn, right?
Yes.
And so I think that's where the burden falls, as opposed to trying to like gatekeep like Disney costumes. Like I don't think that's the biggest issue when it comes to cultural appropriation in the sphere of like costumes and Halloween and stuff, because the Disney characters are less so about the race, but the Mexican outfits, the Indian outfits, the Hawaiian outfits, those are racial things, and those need to be like, handled appropriately.
So I want to present a new kind of question. So similarly, with Disney costumes, we've of course got a whole range of superheroes. And recently, I've seen some tweets in terms of different arguments as to whether it's right or wrong for a little boy or whoever it may be, to dress up as someone from Wakanda. So I'm just going to read out a few of the tweets and I'll put them on screen. So this first one: white people thinking about dressing up or doing cosplay for Black Panther. This is the only acceptable character costume to wear, no exceptions. And it's a picture of Martin Freeman's white character. And then another one: all races dress up like superheroes all the time, so don't get offended when white people dress up in Black Panther costumes. I think it's the ultimate compliment. I have no problem with a kid wearing a costume of his or her favourite character, regardless of race or gender. Children are colourblind until society shows them that there is a difference. Just visit any preschool in a city and a high school in the same city. And then last one: dear white people, yes, Black Panther came to cinemas in February, so yes, this Halloween will be prime time for Black Panther costumes. Please note, there are white characters in Black Panther for you. I don't want to see any bald-headed white women talk, etc. Anyway, so this is similar to what we were saying earlier, and I was just curious, how do you guys think we should deal with people having such different opinions on the matter? If someone from the Black community says it's right and someone says it's wrong, perhaps in your friend group, how should we make a balanced decision on this? What's the best way to go about it?
Oh, wow.
So I think like this, tying into kind of like what I was saying earlier, that like a kid dressing up as their favorite character is not necessarily a racialized decision, and I think there has to be a balance of understanding that like while children in their like in the innocence of how they view like racialization, they kind of don't know what it is yet, right? Dressing up as your favorite character is one thing. I think when it comes to how everyone understands, like, how do we come to a group consensus?
Yeah.
Ultimately, I don't think you can. As someone who has tried to convince people that cultural appropriation is a problem, or convince people of my point of view, I think ultimately, like, if a kid wants to do something, and someone's like, they're just a kid, like, stop trying to make this bigger than it is, and someone else is like, this is a much bigger, wider representation of, like, the structures in our society.
Mm-hmm.
There's no common ground, I think, where those two people are going to align.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think those 2 points of views clash in a way that, like, that's not particularly going to change.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there are a great number of people who don't necessarily think that, like, a young boy dressing up as the Black Panther is an issue, right?
Yeah.
But, like, think that there's maybe something that could be going on there, they just don't understand what it is, right? And I think what is important in these conversations is implementing a, like, rhetoric in society. Like, this is something that needs to be moved towards. I don't think it exactly exists yet, but people just need to be better at listening to people of color, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, like, I think when it comes to something like this, like, how do we come to an agreement? I don't think everyone is going to.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the people who want to come to an agreement, what they need to do is listen to the people who have an issue with the topic at hand, right? I, for example, don't completely understand the, like, relationship that Black people have to Black Panther because I'm not Black. Like, I will never fully understand that, and so I can never understand the sentiment fully as to why, like, people might not want the, like, symbol of Black Panther to be encroached upon.
Yeah.
What I can understand is that, like, the whole sphere of, like, Wakanda as, like, a concept in the MCU is, like, much bigger and symbolic of, like, African culture and African people, and the reason why, like, Black people might not want that encroached upon when it comes to costumes and when it comes to, like, the way in which people, like, want to express their love of Marvel, so, like, Halloween, cosplay, all of that stuff, is because they finally have some very solid and, like, realistic representation of what, like, African cultures look like without it being, like, supremely stereotyped and, like, supremely, like, problematic.
Yeah, I'd say that's completely fair enough. MCU's created this community, I guess, that was actually based on heritage as opposed to just you know, a globalized kind of version, which is, you know, all well and good, but yes, I can see it's got a lot more meaning.
I just like that, what you're saying. It's not necessarily wrong and it's not necessarily racist to dress up like a character like Moana or Black Panther, like the examples we're using, but it's, for lack of a better word, selfish to take that away from people of colour when they have not as much option as I do as a white woman. So I think it's interesting, So it's not wrong, but it's not right either.
I think with, like, specifically, like, Black Panther as an example, and this is kind of a tangent, but, like, this, I think this is, like, worthy of talking about, right? That, like, when we talk about, like, Black Panther and, like, kids dressing up as characters from Black Panther, or even people dressing up as characters from Black Panther, kids don't understand the racialized experience of, like, non-Black kids don't understand the racialized experience of Black people necessarily, right? Most of them don't, at least not to the full extent. A kid being like, I want to dress up as T'Challa, I want to dress up as the Black Panther because he's cool and he, like, has a really cool, you know, he's really cool in the Marvel movies. Like, he's really cool in Black Panther, he's really cool in, like, the Avengers movies and stuff. Like, I want to dress up like him is a different thing from being like, I want to dress up as one of the other characters in Black Panther who is, like, just native to Wakanda, right? I think, like, for specifically the Black Panther, or even, like, Killmonger, right? They're both characters where, like, a lot of their identity has nothing to do with their, like, with being from Wakanda, right? Like, they have really cool, like, skills and powers and things like that that people would want to mimic when they wear, like, costumes. At least kids, like, I think that's fine. But I think where the conversation becomes a little bit more, like, you have to be aware of the racial implications, is, like, grown adults being like, I think, like, the other characters from Black Panther just look cool. I'm gonna dress up like them. When they're supposed to be symbolic of these African royalty and things like that, right? Like, that I think is a completely different situation.
It's all about the intention behind. like as you were saying, like it's with the main characters, they're heroes, especially to these kids. Like these are heroes and icons, whereas the other characters, it becomes more of an aesthetic choice, which is where we
absolutely
to appropriating.
I think that's tricky because you can never really know the implication. You could say, oh, someone's dressing up like that, which you might find offensive as a person of colour. But if they're doing it out of good intentions, it's tricky. But the problem with saying that a child can dress one way, but then an adult can't, it's sort of the when do they learn, what age, and then you've got to go back to what you were saying earlier about, at what age do kids become racially aware, and what point do they go, okay, maybe I shouldn't do this anymore.
So I think with that, like, the reason I make this distinction between, like, T'Challa and these, like, main characters in these movies and, like, the other characters is, like, not to negate the role that, like, other characters had in Black Panther, for example, but a lot of the times when you're, like, going to, like, I think a lot of the times, when it comes to, like, costumes, and the relationship they have with, like, adults, they're not the same relationship they have when it comes to children.
That's
like, for children, it's like, if you're dressing up as a superhero, it's probably because that superhero is meaningful to your childhood, right? And meaningful to how you, like, you, like, really, really adore this, like, character, right? Children aren't like, I want to dress up as, like, Killmonger because I think his hair is cool. Like, kids are like, I think he's so awesome, I want to dress up like him.
Right.
I think with adults, when they're wearing Halloween costumes, or even things like cosplay, I think it's such an aesthetic choice that if you're deciding that you want to do cosplay of a character that's wearing, like, very, like, symbolic and traditional and, like, heritage-based, like, African clothing because you think it looks cool, that is a form of appropriation. So I think there is a distinction when it comes to kids and adults, and I think it's, like, worthy noting that, like, as an adult you have more of a responsibility to figure out when what you're doing could possibly be problematic. I think with kids there's much more of an innocence to their decisions. And so it's not like we have to give them the benefit of the doubt because that's not how they think, right? What we're doing is understanding the difference between, like, that I think is something where, like, we're understanding the difference between, like, kids just enjoying something and kids encroaching on a racialized experience.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think, there is a big difference in that sense.
So I'm gonna show you guys this image. Basically, this is an example of a Maui Halloween costume, which was released, children's one, and multiple of these costumes were approved by Disney. And I want to offer this question to you guys. What responsibility should a company such as Disney, or in another case Marvel, be taking in the future? How can we improve on this kind of behavior? Because I think we'll discuss now why we think this costume may not be quite right. This is essentially a form of what I would say, like, blackface, because you're putting on an actual skin suit of a darker tone. So but just triggered by this image, let's discuss.
Okay, so on why this costume is problematic. Elodie, you mentioned earlier that the whole idea of the skin tone, and, like, the skin tone being the same skin tone as, like, Maui skin, is, like, a form of, like, blackface or brownface. Totally agree. And so, I think, like, the issue with this costume is that it gives way for a lot of people to, like, to encroach on the experience of, like, actual Polynesian people and be like, I'm gonna make I'm fine with my kid's skin being darker if he wants to look like Maui and things like that, right? But I think when it comes to the actual responsibility of Disney and these corporations that create these characters, first of all, I think Disney does a really good job of understanding how important, like, people of color represented in movies are, right? I think Disney knows that, like, when they create characters who are, like, minorities, especially if they have deeply cultural experiences, you see this in Moana, you see this in Coco, these movies matter. Like, they matter to young people of color. Like, they're really important, right? I didn't grow up having any like Disney movies that were like really representative of who I thought I was, right? Like, I just didn't really get that.
Yeah.
Because there was nothing there. As I said earlier, the closest thing I had was Jungle Book, and like, I didn't grow up in a village. Like, I couldn't relate, you know? Like, but I think they're like the experiences portrayed in movies like Moana and like Coco, while they're not necessarily like relatable, they're like really symbolic of the cultural experiences people have at home and things like that, right? So I think it's really important to acknowledge that like we have to give credit where credit is due, where like Disney does a really good job of making kids feel like they can see themselves, or at least they're doing a better job of doing that than they did before.
Yeah.
What I think in terms of like costumes and having Disney approved costumes like this is I think this is where it becomes kind of a slippery slope, where it's like if you're helping protect the cultures of people of color, are you stopping them from being able to fully engage, right? And so I think, for example, this kind of a costume worn by a young Polynesian boy is great. Like he gets to dress up as a character that he feels like empowers his culture or he just cares about, and that's cool. But if you're suddenly like a costume for these characters could be worn by white people and that's like cultural appropriation, and suddenly you take them off the markets, that kind of makes it so like these young kids are like, okay, but like why can't I dress up as this character? Like, he looks like me, I like him.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing where like parents are kind of like, why can't I let my kid like dress up as this character who like is from the same cultural background as him? Like, I understand that it's like cultural appropriation is a problem, but I am not appropriating my own culture, right?
Okay.
So I think like when it comes to corporations, like Disney approving this costume and like potentially allowing people to like do brown face and blackface, like that's problematic, and maybe this should be designed better, like this costume. But I think making costumes available to young people of color that like make them feel proud of their like skin tone and their race like is really important. And so having this stuff available, even if it falls into like the wrong hands, which like determining who those hands are, like who are the wrong hands, like that's kind of difficult in the first place. I don't think that's right. Like, I think it's fair for kids to want to dress up as these characters that they feel represent them, without the worry that like somebody else might dress up and as this character and like it might be like potentially offensive, you know?
Okay, so sorry, I mean perhaps it's rash in a respect of outrage culture to immediately, because there was a lot of backlash on Disney for this, a lot, you know, obviously on Twitter and all that kind of thing. Are we suggesting that perhaps it's not fair for people to be so outraged when perhaps it's not such a monetary greed behind this, but it is actually giving people the opportunity?
I think what Aashia was saying in a more succinct way is that the costume itself is not wrong. It's the people who are taking it and misusing it, which is the same for a lot of things.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's things are there, the costumes are there, and we can choose to take them and manipulate them and exploit them. But it's our, you know, it's up to us as a community to decide what we do. So
yeah, I mean, fair enough.
I think when it comes to the whole thing of outrage culture, it's like I don't think we can say necessarily that like people who get angry at this costume are like part of like unnecessary outrage culture. A lot of the people who will be offended by this costume will be actually Polynesian people, right? And again, that's like an instance in which it's really important. Again, if you're not part of an experience and someone is offended, start by listening to them, right? While I'm saying like it's not fair to kids, especially like young people of color, to take costumes like this away from them. That's maybe not the perspective of like an actual Polynesian person who's like who can feel that a costume like this can harm them, right? And so that's why I think like it's not easy to kind of cater to everyone, but it's still like you have to listen and you have to make like decisions based on what people who are actually going to be harmed are feeling. you know?
Yeah.
I think that's super interesting, just in general. This is just a point,
Yeah.
although it's very well and good for us. And of course we're entitled to our own opinions, all of us, to say what's right and what's wrong. And yeah, we're going to have our own opinions regardless. But like you're saying, we need to become better at listening, and whatever I have to say really doesn't make a difference, because a Polynesian person is coming to me and saying, I'm offended by this, it's cultural appropriation. I then have absolutely no right to say, no, it's not because of this.
Because of my
I don't, I can't
agree.
choose whether they get offended or not, and I'm going to have my own opinions, and I'm but going to try my very best to listen, because ultimately they have authority over me when it comes to stuff like that. That's just...
So I want to propose the question, in the future, do you guys... How can we, as a society, work better to educate, in this case, children? And also, what's the role of parents versus schools in this kind of argument?
I don't think that's a versus situation. I think we're learning. I think there's been definitely a big shift in the past few years, and we've learned so much more. And like I said, there's a line, and we do tend to cross it in a lot of cases, like the ones we've just been talking about. But we're gradually clearing the lines, making boundaries, and deciding what's right. So what we can do in future to move forward, I don't know, I think keep at it. I mean, we're lucky with the rise of social media that we're getting fed so much stuff. I mean, like you said, outrage culture is definitely a thing, and people are definitely taking it a step too far. But I don't know, I think we're headed in the right direction.
For the positive at the end of the day, perhaps.
I think we are definitely heading in the right direction.
Okay,
Yeah, I would agree that we're heading in the direction. I mean, I think, Emma's totally right that it's not a, like, parents versus teachers situation. Like, I think the thing that this generation has that's really important, I don't know if you guys know any kids who are in school, and I don't know if this is the case in the UK, but I know in North America, like Canada and the US, young kids, especially in like sort of more liberal and like diverse areas, they learn a lot in school about a lot of really cool stuff. Like, my roommate has like 3 siblings, and 2 of them are like in elementary school, and they are constantly learning like about like diversity and its importance, and they learn about like they learn on like sort of more dumbed down levels, obviously, but they learn about things like sexuality, and they learn about things like gender and like all of these things that are complex concepts to kids, but like they're not if you just teach them about it. And so I think like in terms of schools, and I don't think it's just schools, I think the media does this as well, like kids shows, Disney movies, like things like that. A big part of it is normalization. Normalizing the idea to kids of like just diversity, and not trying to like making just like equality as an idea just normal in what is presented to kids. Like, when I was watching Disney growing up, every like ethnic minority character was a massive stereotype. like the like notable Latino character in Disney is like Esteban from The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, and he's just like a stereotype, right? And then you see like that there's that show which is called like Jessie or something. It has like a brown kid who's like, I think, an orphan or something, and he just has the thickest accent, and he's just like this weird caricature of like a young Indian boy, and like that's really weird that these still exist. But I think now Disney is doing much less of that. They just have like diverse casts that aren't like super stereotypical, right? And I think like that's really good. I think when schools normalize the idea of talking about like race in their curricula, that's really good. That helps. And I think when it comes down to parents, it's difficult to explain something like cultural appropriation to your kid. I don't think that's something you can necessarily like teach them about when they're like 6, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not one conversation either.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing thing of constantly trying to reiterate to your kids, like, this is how you respect other cultures. This is how you like not ignore, I don't think ignore is the right words. This is how you go against the biases that exist in society. This is how you can be a better person and a better like ally to your like you know, friends who are like people of color, you know? And I think a lot of it is just like normalizing such ideas. I think there's a lot less like actively talking to your kids about like very large racial concepts than you would think there is. I think a lot of it is just creating the foundation of like having your kids in a normal manner just respect diversity and try to like negate stereotypes in their life as much as possible. Yeah. And then they kind of just learn when they're older.
I think by creating this like drama around things, it definitely can be dangerous because it becomes like on your mind and you go to the extremes, whereas in creating a safe environment where diversity is just a discussion and equality is just normal, as you were saying, that's much more important. I think much more effective.
So there's the aspect of normalization being really important. So like normalizing diversity and normalizing like respect amongst children is really important, but also correcting their behavior in a manner that isn't like really aggressive is something that's also very important. I think kids are naturally going to do like problematic things because they don't know better. I think it's up to not just parents but schools and like other influencers and like in the lives of children, especially with the rise of like social media and things like that. Any person who has an influence on a kid's life, it is important for them to like correct behavior where the kid is going to listen and not see it as like
in a loving way,
being disciplined. Like I think that's a really big part of it as well, normalizing like good stuff and then correcting in a like respectful manner to your kids to the point where they actually listen to you, like correcting behavior that would be problematic.
Just like you would do with absolutely anything that your kid did. I mean,
absolutely,
yeah, just increasing awareness in general. All right,
Well, I think this has been really good, guys. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you for letting us.
I really enjoyed the discussion. I think we've covered some really good points. And let's all cheers to the future of
amazing
culturally appropriating.
All right,
cheers.
Okay, so thank you so much. This was Emma and Aashia and Elodie. Goodbye.
Bye.